Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the workshop as well. I would like also to say thanks to our guest speakers for having come to Bilbao. So welcome, ongi etorri, Basque. Welcome to Bilbao and to the University of Deusto, to Roberta and René. I would also like to welcome Professor Ahmed from Koç University, who is also part of INTEGRIM and of this particular working package. I'm very happy you are also here today with us, and also thank you to the contributors of today, and also to my colleagues of the Institute here. So I'm very happy we have this second workshop, and we have, I hope we have a nice and good day to discuss about these interesting topics. And my introduction, on the one hand, is to open a little bit the debate. Secondly, to incorporate some references to languages, because we are also interested in bringing the linguistic diversity to the table, because we presume our guest speakers will focus a bit more on religion and on ethnicity, maybe nationality, and we are interested also in bringing the linguistic diversity. And finally, I will try to bring a proposal, a provocative proposal to reshape the way we tend to approach cultural diversity management. And to do this, in 15-20 minutes, I'll follow 4 consecutive steps. First, to refer to this, the 2 main factors of identity, languages and religions. Second, a very quick view to history, how these factors have played a role in history. And then third, to try to analyze the differences in the dynamics of these 2 elements, how these 2 elements affect the public management today. And then there will be the 4th and last step, which will be to make a proposal or maybe a question about how do we have to treat these 2 elements, if we have to treat these 2 elements in similar or a different way. So the first point would be to remember that we are talking here about minority groups. We are talking about cultural identities, and just to limit a little bit the scope of discussion, we are talking about these cultural identities, cultural groups. There are other possible minorities, but here we refer in principle to those traditionally referred by international law, by domestic law, as minorities. As according to the in the international community, we find the references to racial minorities, to ethnic minorities, to linguistic minorities, to religious minorities, and to national minorities. These are the concepts included in international documents or European constitutions. If we read the 50 European constitutions, we will find references to these particular concepts. Today, not racial, but ethnic minorities, linguistic, religious minorities, and national minorities. And it's only one constitution in Europe which includes also what they call the philosophical and political minorities, but it's the Constitution of Belgium. But there is no any other adjective to be linked with the word minority in the European constitutions. So in a word, these are groups that demand a recognition, and a particular kind of recognition, and probably inclusion within a public system of government in a particular democratic society where they represent, by definition, less than half of the total population. So these are groups which are identified because of some cultural elements, and that by definition have no possibility in democracy of imposing their own views in terms of the symbols of the state, or the way the rights are read, or the way the political power is implemented. And if we look to the European history, it's pretty clear to me that there are 2 main factors of identity, 2 main factors, cultural factors, which create this kind of minorities, and these are language and religion. These are the 2 main elements of identification of cultural identities, or creation of groups. And in all European cultural identities, we find one of the 2. For instance, through language, we make distinction between, for instance, Flemish and Walloons in Belgium, or we make the difference between the Slovenes and the Croats, or we identify the Breton in France because of the language, or the Latins in Italy, or the Frisians in the Netherlands, just to give some European examples. And through religion, we make the difference between, for instance, Serbs and Croats, or Karelians and Finnish, or Lithuanians and Latvians, or Ruthenians and Ukrainians, or Pomaks and Bulgarians, or Gagosian and Turks. Even those groups that tend to be considered as ethnic minorities, like, for instance, the Roma people, or some indigenous, so-called indigenous peoples, like the Sami in Scandinavian countries, or immigrant groups, they also have a particular language or particular religion as part of their identity. It's very difficult to find a group which is not linked to one of these two elements. Obviously, these two elements are complex in themselves, and it's very difficult to define them. Both law and politics, they find many problems in defining what is language and what is a religion. In the field of languages, because it's very difficult to separate language from dialects. That's a great issue in many places, and also some sub-elements related to languages, like, for instance, the glottonyms, which means the name of the language. In some places is very sensitive, and it has to do with identity. For instance, in Catalan and Valencian, Romanian and Moldovan, Ruthenian and Ukrainian, this kind of differences. And also the script used to write the language is in many countries or in many regions a very sensitive identity issue. And in terms of religion, obviously it's very difficult to define what is a religion, and there are some differences within theoretically the same religion which also are very critical to identity. But in any case, these are the two elements which are by far the most frequently mentioned when we define minorities, if we analyze all the legal and political definitions we can find in both international or domestic documents. So I move forward and to say that diversity obviously is not a new phenomenon, it's not a new feature of European societies. Language and religious diversity have always been present in our societies. In fact, in Europe, we take Europe as a traditional region, a continent with traditional elements of identity. There have been there is more than 100 languages, traditional languages spoken in the European continent, and a good number of religions, not just different kinds of Christianity, but also, of course, Islam and Judaism and paganism and Buddhism even. There is a European people which is Buddhist, and that's also part of the European heritage, cultural heritage. And we can acknowledge that the relevance of these two elements as factor of identity also has evolved in history. These two elements as factors of creating minorities and demands from minorities, it has evolved and has changed. And in fact, they have, these two elements, they have substituted each other in different periods of the history. If we go back to the beginning of the modern age, for instance, it is clearly religion who plays the most significant role in underlining differences and making necessary some management of diversity. However, linguistic differences did not seem to be very relevant at the beginning of 16th century or 17th century, for instance. It is within the context of Reformation and in the religion wars that the first international protection of minorities or diversity appears in international and domestic law. But during 18th and 19th centuries, little by little, language would gain more and more relevance as a factor of identity and would become, little by little, the main factor around which European nations would be built. And this is obviously the period in which nationalism develops in most of the European nations. So in the 19th century enshrined the national differences, and through it the linguistic differences. And it framed the struggle against diversity, because there has been a struggle against diversity within the limits of each state, if European nation state, and much more in the linguistic field than in the religious one. And the consolidation of the nation state in the last 100 years has also helped in this process. But at the same time, it is true that in the last 2-3 decades, because of the population movements, and also due to some shifts in terms of communication and way of life, all these new developments have provoked that the religious differences and identities came again to the political agenda and to the political debates. And the religious fact is again present at the current debate on cultural diversity and cultural identities, much more than in the 60s or in the 70s, even if religion now is present in a more complex way, and even through this new phenomenon of new processes of what is called believing without belonging and belonging without believing. But it's again here, and it's like if we were going back in history to the period in which religion was also very relevant. In this context, we can ask ourselves how to manage from a democratic perspective the diverse identities built around these two cultural criteria. Can they be managed in a similar way? Should they be managed in a similar or different way? Which are the substantial differences between these two main elements of cultural identity construction? The identification role of both of them is similar. They both identify groups and cultural identities, but their dynamics are quite different and even sometimes divergent. There is a number of clear differences in the functioning of these two factors of identity, and I will try to list some of them. Number one would be that looks like the language is something which is necessary for everybody. So we all need a language to communicate, even if we use, for instance, sign language or whatever, but it is considered as another way of language. And so from that perspective, all the inhabitants, all the population, they could be linked or identified with at least one language, but that doesn't happen in the field of religion. So not everybody is identified with having one religion, because obviously there are people who is not religious or have no religion or don't want to be identified with any kind of religion. So we have some uneven balance in this first. This is a first difference which shows this unbalanced situation. Difference number two. Obviously, one particular person, one single individual, can speak more than one language. It can be fluent in more than one language, and even more important, can be linked to more than one language in terms of feelings. But it looks that doesn't happen in the field of religion, in principle. But it's true that everything is more complex than the kind of simplification I'm doing now. It's not so easy to identify what is the language of the individuals, always. Because if we try to answer to the question, what is one's language, we normally tend to take what we call technically L1. But what is L1 is not always clear. Normally we refer to the mother tongue, whatever it is, mother tongue. But we could also take the father tongue. And by the way, in the case of an homosexual couple, it could be mother tongue 1 and mother tongue 2. They would be mother tongue both or father tongue both. But mother tongue and father tongue could be different, of course. And it could be also different, the language which is used in that family. So it could be different, the language in which that person has grown up or has been brought up. So that could be 3. And we could also consider the language of that person to be that language in which he went to the school system, or he was some way educated through the educational system. Or it could also be the language he or she speaks the best, which could also be different. Or it could be the language he or she speaks the most, which can also be different. Or maybe the language to which he or she feels more feeling of closeness, which could also be different, as it happened in many minority situations, with people very much attached to a particular language that they do not speak or they do not speak fluently. So I think I have mentioned like 8 possible different languages. Most of us, all these 8 are the same. So we are not so complex. But still, this is getting more and more complex. There are more possibilities than it's more complex, in the sense that, one person can be attached by feelings to more than one language, so can be member of more than one linguistic group, and may may show demands concerning more different languages. In principle, this does not happen with religion because we understand that you follow one or the other, even if you build your own religion by taking elements from different religions. The syncretism, but that could be still one final product of religion. This is our perspective, because from other cultures you can practice 2-3 different religions at the same time. But normally from Europe, it's not plural, the number of religions you follow normally. Well, this is the second difference. The third one, looking from the political context. In terms of religion, the state, the public sector tends to be neutral, or has to be neutral. We consider it has to be neutral. So there's a public stand position that we have to show some neutrality in terms of religion. We don't promote one or the other. But in terms of languages, we do just the opposite. Normally we declare one official language, or maybe 2, maximum 3. There is no European country having more than 3 official languages for the whole country. So clearly very different political approach to the 2 elements. Number 4, for many people, language is by definition an instrument for communication and socializing. It's a social element to relate with other people. But for many people as well, religion is not. It's something which belongs to the private sphere, to the intimacy of people. For many religious people, it's not an instrument for socializing. It's something which is very personal. They don't have any need of bringing religion or their religion identity to the public forum. But for others, it's the opposite. So again, this is very unbalanced. I mean, there are very, very different ways of understanding religion from this perspective, but very similar ways of understanding the role played by languages. 5, normally languages have traditionally spoken languages have a more or less clear territorial basis to which we can refer. But in the case of religions, this is not normally the case, at least in Europe. Of course, you can make maps about where religions are followed more or less, but in Europe, we don't tend to think in that perspective, from that perspective, because we tend to consider religion as something which is possibly followed or professed in different places, whereas languages tend to be more linked to territories. Not 100%, but there is something there, so this affects to the territorialization of power of politics, which is also very relevant for organizing public management of diversity. Difference number 6. In today's politically correct discourses, we tend to underline the linguistic diversity as a very good asset of Europe, and languages are part of the European cultural heritage, something to be maintained and promoted and respected and considered as a very good element of our culture. This is the discourse. It's not the policies are not consistent with this, not totally consistent with this, but this is the discourse. But in terms of religion, the discourses are not so clear, because there are also sectors for which religion is not a positive element in itself. Maybe on the contrary. So it's not so easy to find a definition of religious diversity as a part of the European cultural heritage, for instance, as something to be protected and maintained and promoted. Because opinions on the value of religion and opinions on the value of languages seem to be quite different as well. Number 7, in societies like this, linguistic diversity evokes traditional diversities. It's much more linked to old minorities and traditional groups, whereas religious diversity more and more is linked with new minorities. Not only, but it's getting, I would say, almost monopolized by new minorities in societies like this. So again, a divergence here. Linguistic minorities, and if you take the European Charter for Regional Minority Languages, clearly excludes languages of migrants, whatever it means, and that's another thing, that's another discussion. But when we talk about religion, for instance, the legal instruments, we don't have the possibility of making a clear distinction between old and new minorities or members of old and new religions. And finally, number 8, there is also a very clear legal difference. According to international law and also to comparative constitutional law, freedom of religion is a fundamental right. In all international instruments and documents, we will find a clause protecting freedom of religion. Freedom from religion and freedom of religion, it should be. So religion in itself is the object of one particular civil right, which is clearly consolidated as part of the fundamental rights everywhere. Well, everywhere, I'm talking too enthusiastically, at least in the European countries, members of the Council of Europe. But there is nothing exactly the same in terms of languages, because we have the right to use the language and the right to the language, which could be part of freedom of expression, but to begin with, freedom of expression does not talk about language. So language is behind freedom of expression, but it's not freedom of language. We have freedom of expression, which would be like the right to use the right to the language, but there is no right to a language. Obviously, that has to do with the political management of languages and this option in favor of official languages and so forth. But they are located in very different places, also in the legal order, region, and languages, and particularly when we read fundamental rights. Well, all these differences, functioning differences, or differences in dynamics between regions and languages would explain that even if both of them are the main factors of identity, the main factors of creating minority groups or identifying minority groups, their legal and political management should not be the same. However, I think we cannot forget that the last fundamental reason for their protection is in both cases the protection of the dignity of the individuals, dignity of the human being, and in particular dignity of those belonging to minority groups, which includes, of course, their cultural identity. And we cannot forget all these effects to the reading of a good number of fundamental rights that should be read or reread through the collective identities of the citizens and not in spite of them. So the question is, and this is my last point, the question is, are these differences really substantial in terms of legal protection or in terms of political management of diversity? Is the reason of their protection sufficiently different as to build totally diverse or totally different systems of protection, which by definition means that one or the other, one of the elements will be better or more protected than the other? So this is obviously the case today, what is happening today. But I would like to test, I would like to challenge this approach and to propose a similar consideration for both elements. That's to say, for both kind of minority groups, for all minorities, for all kind of cultural identities, regardless they are built around a particular language or a particular religious belief. Shouldn't we pay more attention to cultural identity as a common basis, a right to cultural identity, the common basis of each person to be respected and protected? So I'm talking about a right to cultural identity, equally including either language or religion, and therefore shouldn't we challenge the current ways of protecting diversity, which is to say promoting some common elements of identity, particularly in respect to linguistic diversity. I'm obviously pointing to linguistic diversity. Probably the main difficulty lies in the fact that languages, to say it better, some languages today are in fact very much linked or attached to particular national state identities, whereas in practice religions are not anymore. Religious identities happen to be less demanding. They are demanding, but they don't demand in the same level than linguistically based national identities. This can be confirmed by the evolution of comparative constitutional law in this respect in the last 50 years. Religion-related constitutional clauses have dramatically lost relevance, and they have somehow merged into kind of a common pan-European model of constitutional clause to refer to religion. if we look to the evolution of the constitutions in the last 50 years. While language protection or language recognition constitutional clauses have doubled in this same period. Now we have many clauses in constitutions referring to language and to official languages, to majority languages, than 50 years ago. If religious differences, as sexual orientation differences, for instance, have to be managed regardless of the history, regardless of the territory, regardless of the collective identity, why we shouldn't do the same with linguistic or ethnic differences? Why harmonization practices, like for instance reasonable accommodation, cannot be applied also to other cultural elements, such as language, thus reshaping the relation between public institutions and citizens, giving additional protection to minorities and not to majority elements, as it is happening in terms of linguistic diversity. So the reason to bring this approach to this debate is just the human rights and equality perspective. This reading I propose to be explored could be a step, not popular yet, in the process of one sorry, this is difficult to pronounce because I'm inventing words here. Deterritorialization of politics, or deterritorialization of power. Probably this cannot be said in English, but the majorization of public management, and in the necessary construction of post-identity polities. So deterritorialization of politics and power, demajorization of public management and construction of post-identity policies. The current test for human rights can only be passed by opening the new multicultural readings of fundamental rights to all cultural factors of identity, to all strong cultural factors of identity, which means language and religion. This means today language in the same level of religion, even if this entails to incorporate a new challenge to what is the traditional construction of the state-national identities, which I think is the main point in this, or the main difficulty, or the main problem for moving forward in this reading I am provocatively proposing for the debate. And that's all on my side, and now I leave the floor. Thank you.